Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again today, this morning, this evening, wherever you are around the world for our second Tangaaza session. We are very grateful to have Dr. Lwazi Lushaba join us again to speak on the topic of modernity. For those of you who weren't here last week, Dr. Lushaba spoke about nationalism, and I'm sure he will give a brief recap on the points he laid out in last week's session as we transition into modernity today. Some quick housekeeping items in terms of the logistics of how this is going to work. Dr. Lushaba will deliver a lecture. At the end of that lecture, there will be a Q&A. We ask that you direct all of your questions to the Q&A function, which you will see at the bottom of your screen. For me, it's the third icon from the right. And instead of directing your questions to the chat, please direct your questions there. The chat can be used to introduce yourselves. We're so grateful to people who have already introduced themselves. Tell us where you're from, where you're calling in from, your nationality. We're so grateful to have you all here today. Right now, it gives me great pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Lushaba, Professor of Politics at the University of Capetown, and a very good friend of mine. Thank you, Dr. Lushaba.
I thank you very much for that kind introduction. A very good afternoon, good morning, to colleagues and friends who are joining us, this Saturday. It gives me quite a pleasure, to be able to return here today, to continue the conversation we started, last week. As Professor Bengi Rabuhemba has stated, last week we spoke, or rather we had a conversation, over the subject of nationalism. What we're going to try and do today is to look at yet another concept closely related to nationalism, the concept of modernity. And towards the end, we're going to try and join these two concepts together. And that's where you might get a sense, of the discussion we had last week about nationalism. So that said, what I'm going to try and do today is, introduce to you the concept of modernity. It's a concept, with a long career, a long torturous career for that matter, a long torturous intellectual career. A lot has been written about it. And so what I'm going to do is to give you enough theoretical handle, in order to be able to make sense of the many things that have been written and said about this concept of modernity. What is this thing called modernity? And as I said, towards the end, I'm going to join it to nationalism so that we see, how, nationalism gets entangled, with the idea of modernity. And in that entanglement, see how the continent is brought, into this, very, unseemly entanglement between, nationalism and modernity. So let us begin by trying to elucidate, what is this thing called, modernity. Now, more or less like nationalism, modernity has a very specific history, and this history has a very specific geography. And so the history of modernity has a birth date, but it also has, or the concept of modernity also has a birthplace. The birth date of modernity is the 16th century onwards. The birthplace is Europe. Now, there is something I need to make very clear. Modernity is not it doesn't have an immediate, or an instantaneous birth. So there is not one particular day where suddenly we slept and we woke up with modernity. It's a process, it's a long process that spans centuries. It was preceded by two other processes or two other movements, if you wish. One was the Enlightenment, and the other was Renaissance. Now, these processes precede modernity, which, as I've said, began from the 16th century onwards. For those of you who study, different subjects, even if you study literature, you would study something about Renaissance literature, or you would study something about, Renaissance history if you study history. And this is all European, by the way, European Renaissance history, or, you study Enlightenment philosophy if you study philosophy. Now, these two processes precede modernity, as we're going to talk about it today, but they were its condition of possibility. And so in certain instances, you would hear modernity being spoken about, in a very, linked, or rather in a manner that suggests that, it's linked or it's inseparable from enlightenment, which is at other times called the Age of Reason. Enlightenment is also at other times called the Age of Reason. Now, I'm going to bracket these two movements that, preceded modernity. But let us keep it at the back of our minds that it was Enlightenment and the Renaissance. Italy, of course, was very central to the process of the Renaissance. I'm going to bracket these two processes, and I'm sure you would encounter them somewhere dealt with, much more at length. But at the back of our minds, we must know that modernity was preceded, but not just preceded in terms of time. These two movements were what rendered modernity possible. They were its condition of possibility. Modernity itself, comes into fruition from the 16th century onwards. And again, you would see here very close similarities between what we said last week and what we're going to say, because remember we said the age of nationalism was the age of industrialization. Nationalism comes into existence at the moment, of Europe's transition from the pre-industrial to the industrial age. It's the same thing with modernity. Modernity comes into fruition at the moment when Europe transitions, from the pre-industrial to the industrial age, or if you wish, at the moment when Europe transitions from the pre-modern to the modern age. What was this transition? What did this transition from the pre-modern to the modern age, entail? Now, today, to answer that question, I want to suggest something that might be a good compass. Today, we think about being modern as more or less something natural, quote unquote, as something inevitable, such that we think that everyone knows what it means to be modern. Whether one is speaking from Rwanda, or is speaking from Ethiopia, or from Brazil, or from India, we seem to think that we know what a modern person is. So when we say someone is modern, there is no version of being modern that is Brazilian, that is Indian, that is Rwandese, that is Ethiopian. We think of being modern as this one, or, dimensional, outlook. And we take it for granted that to be modern, as I've said, means the same thing, in all of these different geocultural locations, that we all, live in. But we never bother to untangle, what does it mean to be modern? So when Europe transitions from the 16th century onwards, from being pre-modern to being modern, a few things happen. And we're going to highlight those things that are very fundamental to our understanding of what modernity means. So one of the things that happened at the moment of Europe's transition from the pre-modern to the modern period, or from the pre-industrial to the industrial age, is that the process of production was fundamentally transformed. How was it fundamentally transformed? There was a movement or a transition from a use of animate sources of energy to inanimate sources of energy. Basically, prior to that moment, the process of production depended on animate sources of energy. Either it was human energy or animal energy, which meant that the process of production, was limited by the fact that these animate sources of energy could not be exploited without air. Because, whether it was human beings or whether it was animals, their capability, to produce was limited by the fact that, these were biological beings. And so the process of production, had to have, or was limited or circumscribed, by the capability of these animate, sources of energy to continue producing without, collapsing, so to say. But what happens at the moment of the transition is that there is a movement away from animate sources of energy to inanimate sources of energy, which meant that the process of production could now go on ad infinitum without it being interrupted, and so production could go on, for instance, day and night. So this is the birth of the factory. If you want a more sophisticated way of putting it is that transition from animate sources of energy to inanimate sources of energy was also the birth of the factory. Because the factory could go on producing day and night, because now it was no longer reliant on animate sources of energy. So there was a massification of the process of production. But it was not just a massification in terms of quantity. It was a transformation both in terms of quantity and quality. Now, in terms of quality, what this meant, it's not just quality as in we understand quality today, this is of good quality. No, this is quality in another sense, mostly used by Marxists. So this transformation, in terms of quantity, in the process of production, in terms of quantity and quality, meant that not only could the process, as we've said, the process of production go on uninterrupted, but it also meant that commodities that were produced, came to assume a different meaning or significance. Marxists have a term for it. It's called the fetish of commodities. What do they mean? Now, if you think about a car and water, which of these two commodities, unfortunately, water has also become a commodity. It's basic necessity of life, but it has become a commodity. If you think of these two commodities, you can do without a car. Water is essential for human survival. And so in terms of how fundamental and critical, to life, it is water that is much more fundamental. Maybe a car is too much, but if you think of an expensive coat that people wear, but why is it that the coat has more value in the market than water? What has changed is that value is no longer assigned in relation to the role that a commodity plays in the sustenance of life. Value now derives elsewhere, entirely in the market. It has no relationship. Value is no longer determined by what role that particular commodity plays in the sustenance and reproduction of life. No, it is now derived entirely in the market. And so what the market does is to create a fetish around commodities. That's the quality that happens. That's the qualitative transformation that happens as a result of the birth of the factory, or when production becomes, massified. And so because of the fetish of the commodity, you are happy to pay more for a perfume, than, for water. And we all know, which one is more essential, to life. But it is because the market has created a fetish behind, certain commodities. Now, I'm emphasizing this because we would need this, later on. The fetish of commodities. Let's keep in mind, would need it as we talk about, the utopia of modernity, how modernity projects itself, how it creates an image of itself or an idea of itself. When we talk about modernity that has created an idea of itself as something positive, it is nothing but a fetish. That's why I have spent a bit of time trying to explain what a fetish is. It is nothing really related to reality. It is an idea that you create, and it actually becomes, it's an idea, it begins as an idea that you create, but that idea begins to determine reality. Hope you get what I mean. First, you have an idea that has no relationship with reality, but in time, so effective is the idea that it actually determines reality. That's what modernity is. But we'll get to that point. So when Europe transitions from, the pre-modern to the modern period, the birth of the factory as a result of the transition from inanimate to animate, from animate to inanimate sources of energy, the process of production is transformed such that it can continue ad infinitum. In terms of quantity, production becomes massified, but there is also a qualitative change that happens. Of course, the birth of the factory meant that the process of production changed, but also there was a corollary process. It was the urbanization of society, because the factories tended to draw people from the agricultural hinterland towards the city. And so we come to think of modernity or being modern as something closely related, for instance, to the urban. In fact, some social theorists think about, modernity as urbanization. Now, those two things I want to use, those two pillars of the transition I want to use to launch into something else, which is that the transformation of society into an urban society and the massification of the production process was an empirical, process of change. So it seems like, oh, this was external to human beings. It was out there. Cities sprang up, factories sprang up. But they also had a very fundamental transformation in the outlook of human beings from that moment onwards, these two processes, such that people suddenly became urbane. Today we speak about people who have an urbane outlook. Today we speak about, people who are very well versed, in the modern world. At other times we put it as, these are people who can negotiate their way around the corridors, either of the private sector or the corridors of power, or whatever else we put it. But all we mean is that these are people who are able to negotiate, with ease, their way around modern capitalism. Now, what this suggests is that the transition into the modern period that is marked by urbanization and the birth of the factory is that what changed was not the outside empirical world. What changed was also human outlook, how people came to relate to the world. So this is why we must think of modernity as a meaning totality. I'm going to write that there because, on the chart, because I think it's a concept that will help us understand what modernity is. Modernity became a meaning totality, which simply means that everything in the world began to have a new meaning. And it was the responsibility, modernity took upon itself the responsibility of giving meaning to everything. What do we mean? Modernity became a meaning totality, not just because people began to have an urbane outlook or because people began to relate to commodities in a certain way, but everything assumed a new meaning given to it by this transition. Like what? The meaning of happiness. Suddenly, happiness began to mean something else from what it had meant before. Those of you who study sociology would probably have been, read a book by Thorsten Veblen on the theory of the leisure class. How leisure became tied to the process of production. Because now you work hard and suddenly you say, because I've worked hard, I need a holiday. It's as though there is a correlation between working hard and a holiday. It was the new meaning of happiness and the new meaning of leisure that tied it and integrated it into capitalism itself, into the process and the logic of production itself, such that nothing in the world, as a result of this transition into modernity, managed to remain outside of the logic of capital. Nothing in the world, as I'm going to demonstrate in a moment to you, was able to escape being given a new meaning by modernity. Again, a useful text in this regard is a text by a Canadian philosopher, Charles Taylor, titled Modern Social Imaginary. There was a new modern social imaginary, a way of encountering the world. But it was not only how people came, to relate to the world, how they thought about what happiness meant, but it was also how people began to relate to themselves. This acquired a new meaning. People began to relate to the world in a certain way. How did they begin to relate to the world? The world became basically available for limitless exploitation in order to increase or maximize advantage to the benefit of human beings. So from the era of modernity, we began to think of the world as possessing unlimited possibilities that are there for us to exploit in order to maximize our advantage, be it happiness, be it accumulation, or anything. So we began to think of the world as an object world that is there for us to exploit unlimited. Suddenly, that logic, has landed us in a world that is on the precipice environmentally. And suddenly we're beginning to realize that the world is actually not available for us for a limitless exploitation in order to maximize profit, advantage, comfort, and everything. We're beginning to revise that logic, but you can see that that thinking is not yet integral. In fact, not that it's not yet. You see, that's why environmental struggles and environmental, consciousness will always remain an added on or an add-on to capitalism. It's as though, oh yes, capitalism or modernity must proceed, but somehow it must manage to take care of this, negative that is, disturbing its forward march. It's not yet, environmental consciousness is not yet integral to the proceeding or to the movement forward of modern capitalism. No, it's just an inconvenience that it has come to realize that it's responding to in its forward march. Because the logic of modernity is a complete logic, as we're going to say. But let's maintain structure. You have the transition from the pre-modern to the modern period, animate to inanimate sources of energy, production becomes massified, but societies also become urban. But this change is not external just to human beings. Human beings also are transformed in the way in which they relate to themselves and to the world. But also human beings begin, or rather, this world is a world where everything acquires a new meaning. Happiness is given a new meaning. Suddenly you have a dictionary that explains what happiness means, as if people were not happy prior to that. People were happy prior to that, but you see, a dictionary is a good example of what happens in terms of people's imagination. The dictionary is nothing but an explanation of how things or what meaning things acquired as a result of the new meaning totality called modernity. It does from time to time say to you, this is colloquial. This, belongs to the pre-modern, there's a way they'll put it, this belongs to the pre-modern period. But its object basically is to tell you how modernity gave meaning to everything else. That's why we've called modernity a meaning totality, because there is nothing that remains outside of its logic. It gives meaning to everything, to happiness, to contentment, what it means, to be contented, what it means to be satisfied, everything else. All our sentiments, sadness itself acquired a new meaning, what it meant to be sad, how we mourn, the university is a good ground where you see how people think that they are in charge of their thought processes when they are not. I don't know in the universities you guys are in, but I see young Black people in my university, who all of a sudden, even in their expression of their sentiments, oh wow, that's so gross, and all of those things. Suddenly, they've acquired a new vocabulary with which to express their sentiments. So I don't know how, when people say it's gross, I mean, how they sentimentally show it. But when I walk behind the students in my university, I hear them say all of these things all the time. And I wonder, did you originate that kind of feeling? What does it look like? Where did it acquire meaning, for you? Was that meaning given to you? And all of that. But nonetheless, so the point is, as a result of this transition, life acquired a new meaning, a new outlook. People began to relate to their bodies in a certain way. Suddenly, the body itself became something that was there to exploit. You could do and undo, your body. It was available, because it was just the body, it was not yourself. There is a new concept of the body itself that emerges at that time. To summarize, it's that there's a duality between yourself and your body. And then you begin to wonder, where is yourself if your body is not yourself? People all the time say, no, me, not my body. If your body is not yourself, what does it mean? But so that we don't trivialize it, the point is that at that moment, the body is thought to be separate from the being. The soul represents you, and the body is just but a carrier. Those who study philosophy would know of the Cartesian duality between, res cogitans and res extensa. So that's how virtually everything acquired a new, meaning as a result of that transition. Politically, there were also other processes of change that, accompanied this transition. It was the coming into being of liberal democracy as a result mainly of the French Revolution. It is what gave us the principles of modern liberal democracy, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Remember, we said modernity is not something that happens overnight. It's not instantaneous. It happens over time. We know, of course, that, the French Revolution came only in 1789, so if you look in terms of our timing, it's a bit down the line. But the point is that all of these things, cumulatively added together, are what give us the notion, the idea of modernity today. We would see in a moment. For those of you who read the article by Kaviraj that we had prescribed, he talks about sequence and symmetry. Did these things happen at the same time? Did they happen at different moments? Was it the economic Was it industrialization that triggered liberal democracy? Or was it democracy that triggered other developments? Would answer that question, as we proceed. So as I said, the coming of modernity was also marked by the coming of modern liberal democracy. And so today, when we talk about modern societies, often at the back of our minds, even without us explicitly saying so, we're talking about modern liberal democracies. We're talking about modern capitalist societies. We're talking about societies that are urbanized. We're talking about societies, that have people with an urbane outlook. This is what we mean, by modern societies or modernized society. Now, the coming of liberal democracy and all these other processes left us with a situation where we were uncertain which one came first, which one, even what was the relationship between or amongst these different processes. Urbanization, was it a function of industrialization, or did it actually make industrialization possible? Urbanization, was it a result of commodification, mass production? Liberal democracy, was it triggered by industrialization? Suddenly, we have all of these, singular features of modernity, but somehow that together make up this idea called modernity. We haven't finished about the features. We're going to come to the most important features, in a moment. So, you had liberal democracy adding itself into, this medley. But there was something else, that was even more, important. It is that the birth of modernity was marked by a coming into being of a new kind of cogitation, a new kind of thought, a new regime of knowledge. This was the capacity for rational reason. Now, this is very key and central to us, because you would remember the relationship that we drew, between nationalism, or rather the centrality of reason and rationality within nationalism last week. So the coming of modernity meant the birth of a new norm of knowledge, which is the capability for rational reason. Rationality and reason became the key central tenets of this new modern outlook, of this new modern, thought. And so remember when I said we seem to have an idea of what a modern person is, whether in India, whether in Nigeria, whether in Kenya, whether in, Rwanda, when we say, oh, that's a modern person. Part of what we mean is that this is someone who's capable of rationalizing his or her actions on the basis of rational reason, such that we may confront or engage this person in a public discourse on the basis of rational reason. And this person is going to accept that indeed reason and rationality are the basis for a public communicative reason, for those of you who study Habermas. So modern people are people who assume that, rational reason is the standard for assessing truth, or for ascertaining truth, or for ascertaining the superiority of whatever position one takes. So we assume that, a modern person is someone who's able to justify his or her actions on the basis of reason and rationality. Now, what is reason and rationality? Basically, this new regime of knowledge that comes into effect as a result of the transition into modernity is nothing but a supposition that every action that a human being takes must be justifiable on the basis of the logic of cost-benefit analysis. And so you must be able to justify whatever action you take on the logic of economic rationality. So rationality, which is what we closely identify with Max Weber, again, for those of you who study sociology, is nothing but an extension to life in general of the economic logic of cost-benefit analysis. Economists, the coming into effect of modern capitalism said the logic of every human being is that they must do cost-benefit analysis because every being, according to modern capitalism, is a homo economicus. And so we seem basically born in, with an innate capability for being this homo economicus that rationalizes the economic advantages of our actions, of all of our actions. The extension and the generalization of that logic to society generally by Max Weber is what we call rationality. And so even in instances where it's not a purely economic determination that has to be made, that determination must also be made in the language of advantage and disadvantage, of maximizing advantage and minimizing disadvantage, which is simply this. Why did you come to this, to this seminar this afternoon? You must be able to say, oh no, I stand to benefit, by attending, because then, my knowledge is going to be enhanced and I might then do well, in my studies. If you said to anyone, oh no, I didn't need a reason, I just, because I could be here. We then begin, because we are modern people who are suffused, and convinced of the superiority of rationality, we're going to begin to think there's something wrong with you. In fact, psychologists have a word or a name for it. When you do things without, a reason for them, they say it's a reflex. And modern people cannot operate on the basis of a reflex, and so you must be able to rationalize all your actions. Now, here is something I want to say ahead of, us getting there. The effect of rationality. The effect of rationality is that you study at Northwestern University, you are from Rwanda, you are from Uganda, and I'm picking on Professor, from Buhemba here. We are from Uganda. Your grandmother is sick in Uganda and teetering on, death, and you have an exam coming up, in Northwestern. You then sit and calculate. Should I go see my grandmother, or should I, sit out and write my exam? You begin to do a rational, calculation. Which one makes more sense? And then you say, no, but I'm going to lose a whole year. I'm going to lose my fees and whatnot. Suddenly, you've just forgotten that there is a life, a human life that you might never be able to cherish, and it reciprocates, you're cherishing it, while still alive. You never have that opportunity again. But because you're a modern person, you have entered into the mill, or, the wheel, of modern rationality. Your decision becomes rationalizable. I couldn't go, I had an exam coming up. That's how modern people think. Of a new mode of thinking that is founded basically on, I hope, tell me when I'm not audible. My internet is telling me that, it's unstable, so that if I need to change, my connection, I can do that. So, please just indicate on the chat if anything, if I'm not, yeah. So, the coming of modernity, as we can see, is the coming of a new logic. But there is also a coming into existence, of this new regime of knowledge that we call modern rational reason. Now, we've explained what rationality is. It's the extension into society generally of the economic logic of cost-benefit analysis. What is reason? Reason basically is, again, the coming into existence of a supposition that man is possessed of capability for thought such that nothing in the world remains barred from him or her. And at the beginning, by the way, the birth of reason was an exclusive preserve of men. Men, as this animal who's possessed of reason, was for centuries indeed a gendered man. Now, this European man was not only gendered, it was also a racial man. It was the European man. Now, this European man who's possessed of reason is basically a human being who's suffused with a supposition that says there is nothing in the world that is inaccessible to him because he's possessed of reason, which means that the whole of the world becomes available to him and accessible to him on the basis of his capability for thought, which is reason. And so the world becomes, all regions of life become unencumbered, to this modern rational person, because he's possessed of reason before, it's extended to women. So reason basically is the supposition that the world is accessible, from this, Archimedean position. Basically, you can shine the light of reason to any aspect of life and give meaning to it. And so reason is basically possessed of a kind of arrogance that says there is nothing that I can't explain. Now, this is where you see reason. Young people who've just gone to the university from the rural areas, to take a very, a very, pertinent example. You see young people who've gone to the university. They grow up in rural areas, throughout the continent. And suddenly, and brought up by their grandmothers and their mothers who basically have braved life, in all its difficulties, in all its, inclement weather, and have brought these people, to age of adulthood. And these young people go to the university. Suddenly, after just 6 months of being at the University of Capetown, when they return to, the rural areas, these young people are suddenly possessed of capability to tell elderly people who brought them up what is wrong with their lives. They're not negotiating. They are telling, people who brought them up suddenly what is wrong with their lives. But, why are you my mom? Why is it that your life is like this? Or grandma, why is it like this? These are people who brought you up. Because suddenly you've just been at the University of Cape Town for 6 months, why do you think we are possessed of superior reason or logic to be able to tell people who've lived longer than you that there's something wrong with their lives? And you don't negotiate. I'm not saying you shouldn't engage with it, but we are not negotiating. You speak with a certain kind of authority. It is because you then think of yourself as being possessed of this reason, modern reason, that is authoritative over all aspects of life. If you want another example, because I think of myself as possessed of reason, you see it, white people from Europe know nothing about Islamic societies. They land in, an Islamic society. And the moment they get out of the aeroplane, they tell you 1,000,001 things that are wrong about Islamic culture. They don't speak the language. They don't know, the cultural history. They don't know the cultural, a logic behind, the things they are passing judgment over. But because they are possessed of this superior reason, they think of themselves as having a right to pass a judgment. So Even someone who remains outside of a culture can conclude about the reasonableness and the unreasonableness of the culture. A culture of a people whose language you don't speak. But because you speak this English that gives you reason, you think of yourself as possessed of that authority. So we now know what is reason. It is this unencumbered light of knowledge that can be shown on any region of life. And that region of life must succumb, must avail itself. That's a very important part of reason. It is that when reason shines its light on any region of life and any region, of the world, that region of the world must remain available to that light of reason. If it blocks that light of reason, violence follows it. Because the advantage reason has is that it is backed by power. And it is not just monetary power, it is backed by military power also. So, the coming of modernity is the coming of a new, civilization, so to say. In fact, Kaviraj says it very well somewhere, in the text we recommended, page 4, I think. Yes, he says that, the coming of modernity, page 4, somewhere there on page, and I read, the first thesis states that the transformation of European societies was not just another instance of usual historical change. It was a new kind of newness. Basically, this new kind of newness was or thought of itself as a civilization. But this universal civilization, okay, let's put this clearer. If this new kind of newness thought of itself as a civilization that is universal, all the things that we have said are constitutive elements of modernity appeared universal, suddenly. Reason appeared universal. Rationality appeared universal. Capital appeared universal. The notion of being a being appeared universal. Everything that was liberal democracy assumed itself universal. Everything, appeared universal. And so, this universal civilization, as I've said, thought of itself as universal, but it did not only think of itself as universal. It thought of itself as being available for emulation by the rest of the world. It thought that it could be achieved, by everyone in the world. So reason became universal reason, that was accessible to everyone. Capitalism became universal, could be achieved by everyone. But there was something else. It is that this universal civilization called modernity turned itself into a standard, into a norm. It became an ethical norm, such that if you refused it, judgment could be passed on you. You could be considered unreasonable. You could be considered irrational. You could be considered uncivilized. And so it turned itself into a new universal norm, such that those who refused its logic or remained outside of it, we could pass judgment on them as being uncivilized, as being, irrational, illogical, unreasonable. Now, there's a new ethic of blackmail, basically, that accompanies, modernity, such that, if you refuse modernity, you could be blackmailed into being, then you want us to take us into, the dark era. In a moment, we're going to see what is wrong with that. What we now want to emphasize is the fact that modernity declared itself universal. It declared itself, achievable by everyone everywhere, or accessible to everyone. So it spread across the world. But For Europe, and true, modernity at its beginning is an exclusive preserve, not just of the whole of Europe, but of only Western Europe. And so when it spread to Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe, these other parts of Europe also had to integrate themselves to it. But this is the difference. It is that culturally, these other parts of Europe did not have to get out of themselves to integrate themselves into modernity. Modernity remained within, their culture. Unlike other people who are going to see, which is us, African people, who basically, for, to graphically illustrate, we basically had to jump out of our skins in order to get into modernity. For East Europeans, they could walk into modernity with their skins. Why? Because, modernity, particularly reason and rationality, had a map. Again, today you hear young people calling on each other, be reasonable. So I have an answer when people ask me to be reasonable. I tell them reason is white. And so I don't want to be white. The answer, the reason for that is simple. When reason is an exclusive preserve of the European man, and later on the European woman and European man, it has a map. And its geographical map always excluded us as African people. We were considered as a people outside of reason. And so, because we were considered as people outside of reason, that's why it became possible for Europeans to do all the things they did with us, to colonize, to enslave us first, and then to colonize us, because remember they said slavery and colonialism were meant to bring us into reason, into the light of reason and history. So suddenly, Black people who think they are modern speak in the name of reason, but they forget that the map of reason has always excluded them. For those of you who have the misfortune of living in close proximity with white people, you would know, how easy it is, or how it is a default position for white people when they have to explain something they don't understand about Black people. The quick default position is, these guys are very unreasonable. That's what they say about us. Because always we were thought as people who fall outside of reason. The map of reason has always excluded us. But I've just said a minute ago, that reason became universal. Now, this is where we move to the second part of the talk, where we look at the entanglement, the continent's entanglement with modernity. How did modernity, or how did the continent become entangled with, modernity? How did we as Africans become entangled with modernity, and what were the consequences of this entanglement? And these consequences, not just in history, drawn to the present, what were the consequences and ramifications of this entanglement between Africa and Africans and modernity? So modernity, we have seen, is basically a European process, but that comes to think of itself as universal. But if I've just said it's universal, but on the other hand, I'm saying the map of reason and rationality has always excluded us, how is it universal? Think of it this way. Capital is universal, but the circuits of capital, where capital flows, we know that they are not universal. Capital does not include everyone in its circuits. Or try another example. The fact that a constitution says you have a right to property doesn't mean that you have property. It's a useless claim. It just says you have a right to property. When we know that there are other impediments, socio-economic impediments, that foreclose that possibility or that right to you. Now, to go and tell a poor person, in the rural areas of the continent that, do you know that you have a right to property? Can they take that right anywhere and say that I want this property? So everyone has the right, but not everyone has the property. It's the same about the universality of reason. It claims to be universal, but it doesn't include everyone. But we'll try and make it clear, again. So reason, rationality, and capital, as we've seen, are the key constituent elements of modernity, especially of its new logic of thinking. Now, these discrete elements that constitute modernity, whether it's liberal capitalism, whether it's liberal democracy, what brought them together such that they constitute this cohesive idea? Is it that modernity was a planned process? Europe had sat down to draw a map of how it was going to move into modernity, and at what point would it consider itself modern? No. There was never a concerted plan or a coherent plan for Europe, to move into modernity. These were processes that happened haphazardly. And today they appear like coherent, movements. They are actually not. Why do they appear coherent? Why do we think of modernity? I've tried to elucidate modernity as if it's a cohesive idea. Modernity is nothing but a retrospective telling of the narrative of European history. It's a retrospective telling of the narrative, meaning that later on, when all of these processes had occurred, Europe sits down to then retrospectively impose an order in basically a situation of disorder where things just, happened haphazard. If you want, again, to understand the point we're making, it is that today people often tell us about how early in their childhood they discovered that they were going to become intellectual. So people ask, in a sort of biographical way and say that, so when did you think you were going to become a professor? And then you begin to say, well, at an age of 5, 6, 7, I had a liking. Nonsense. I mean, you were just a child. You knew nothing about anything. All you knew was how to be a child. But what you do is retrospectively you impose an order, to a world that did not have that order. It's the same thing with the idea of modernity. I see there's someone who has a hand up there. Can we quickly attend to it?
We shall take questions at the end.
Okay, that's fine. So what happened is that there is a retrospective telling of this narrative of modernity. And this retrospective telling of this narrative is very utopian. It imposes an order as if there was a concerted movement of European societies beginning from the ancient period through the medieval period to the modern period. Now, it can't be correct. I would use one example to illustrate and move on. So we often think of the spirit of thinking as having been continuous in Europe. So we think, when you go to classes today, they tell you democracy began in Greek societies, and, it has developed from Greek societies, and absolute nonsense. Think of Europe. In the ancient period, we know indeed in Europe that the spirit of thinking was celebrated. That's what gave us, the Aristotles, the Platos, and all of those guys. But the period following that, the medieval period, there was closure. Thinking basically could lead to death. Because remember, in the medieval period, when the church is in charge in Europe, asking certain existential questions was considered a sacrilege. And so you could not ask those questions because in the medieval period, the assumption was that everything that happened on earth was nothing but a manifestation of God's will. So you couldn't ask existential questions like, why am I born a man? Why is someone else born a female? Or why does the rain fall at this time of the year and, not at this time of the year? Those existential questions were not permissible because thinking ceased in Europe at that time as a result of what was called the Great Chain of Being, where the church basically took over the responsibility for thinking. And even the church only thought in terms of the scripture. Every answer it provided was from scripture. So the kind of thought that comes out of Europe in the medieval period is basically religious philosophy. Think of medieval philosophy, for those of you who study philosophy. Medieval philosophy is nothing but Christian thought. There's nothing philosophy about it. It's Christian thought trying to explain or extend itself to the world. Whether it's St. Augustine, whether it's Dante, whether it's whoever, philosopher you can think of in the medieval period, thinking was not permissible. It is until the Cartesian revolution and the Industrial Revolution thinking starts again. But somehow we are presented with Europe that has always treasured thinking from the ancient period. That's what a retrospective telling of the narrative does. It's the same thing with modernity. So who did this retrospective telling of modernity, magnifying the achievements of modernity? Marx, Max Weber, Durkheim. Those were the three key. There were other people. There were other people to be sure, but these are the three people who basically did modernity a huge service of making it appear coherent, of making its achievements appear, magnified than they actually were. Marx says modernity is nothing but commodification of society. He's correct. Everything became integrated into the logic of commodity exchange. So everything becomes commoditized, as a result of modernity. Today, you often would hear, parents enjoin their kids. You must not be friends with people who don't add value to your life, who are not going to help you achieve your goals. When did friendship become instrumental? When did friendship become a commodity? Must we not befriend those who, because of misfortune of not having access to education, ended up not knowing what we do? But because of the logic of commodification, even friendship itself becomes instrumentalized. You must be friends with people who will help you network. In fact, as you grow older, people are going to change the name and say, you must network. You must only be friends with people, who are going to help advance your goals. But also, when Marx says modernity is nothing but commodification of society, he is right, because what happens as a result of the commodification of life is today you can kill someone and go to their families and say to them, I'm happy to offer you compensation, for the death of your brother or your sister or your mother or your father. How much do you want? And you say you want $1 million, and you pay them $1 million, and then you go to court. A court of law will certify that as its verdict. Now, when did life ever have value, monetary value? Marx was correct. What happens as a result of modernity is that there is a commodification of life. Max Weber's contribution was the concept of rationalization. We've looked at it. Emily Durkheim's contribution into the idea of modernity was functionalism. Basically, the supposition that as a result of societal differentiation, people come to perform different functions in society. And so society appears like this inviting place where it says, what are you going to contribute? And then one person raises his or her hand and say, me, I'm going to be a doctor. And society says, fine, we'll remunerate you, accordingly. Another person says, oh, I'm going to be a cleaner. And then society says, oh, we'll remunerate you accordingly. Now it appears like this is an equal terrain where people enter, contributing different skills or, different functions in society, such that as a result of this differentiation, there is an interdependence that leads to an equilibrium. But here is what is wrong in this logic. So we pay a doctor more because we think that the value of the doctor's services, is much higher than that of a cleaner. Now, until recently, we thought so. Or even in the university, they pay us, university professors more than the cleaners. Until we learned recently that if cleaners just decide not to clean lecture halls, we aren't going to be able to teach. So which one is of more value? Suddenly, what you thought was, of higher value, you can't perform it because the lesser value makes the higher value possible. But the point we're making is that, Durkheim's contribution was differentiation of society. So he's the one who gave us the concept of, organic solidarity and inorganic solidarity. I'm edging towards, the third section of my talk, but at this point, I do need to still, explain our entanglement as the continent with modernity. Inasmuch as modernity claims itself as universal, as transhistorical and transcultural, and this is important, those two concepts, make universality have meaning. It's transcultural and transhistorical, meaning that modernity thinks of itself as unsullied by any cultural assumptions. Its universality makes it assume that it is suspended above any cultural assumptions, or there are no cultural assumptions that have come to inform its logic. So it thinks of itself as culture neutral. And so it can actually be, emulated by anyone, or anyone can be socialized to becoming modern without this process appearing like a process of acculturation and deculturation. On the other hand, transhistorical, again, this modernity thinks of itself as unencumbered by time. At any time, the idea remains relevant, and current anywhere. So it's not specific to any historical moment, in research, we call, these nomothetic claims, which means that these are claims that are unencumbered neither by time nor space. They are spatiotemporally, they are not encumbered by time and space. They have no spatiotemporal limitation. So, but we know that modernity did not travel across the seas from Europe into the continent. It actually came across the seas on the back of, okay, let me phrase this differently. Unlike in other parts of the world, our encounter with modernity was midwifed by colonialism. It is colonialism that midwives the birth of modernity in Africa. And so modernity comes to us tethered to a violent process. And so modernity becomes inseparable from violence, especially violence that is perpetrated by the state. And so there is actually and even a supposition that violence that is meted to the citizen with an intention of developing that society, that violence is legitimate. But the point that I want to emphasize is that it is violence, it is colonial violence that midwives the birth of modernity in Africa. But there is another kind of violence that is also done to Africa in order to allow Western modernity germinate in Africa. It is epistemic violence. It is the wiping clean of the slate in Africa, such that you can then impose everything European. European culture, European education, European everything. In order for that process to be possible, you have to deny the existence of anything like that in Africa. And so there is a process of an epistemological wiping clean of the slate in Africa. Closely related to that process of epistemological violence, or what reproduces that, and here I'm ejaculating a longer argument. Closely related to that, process of wiping this slate clean is the projection of Europe as the ultimate category and the relegation of Africa into a zone of negation. What do we mean? So Africa becomes what? Non-European. It becomes non-Western. So we become defined by what we are not. So what are we not? We are not what Europe. We are not Europe. So we are non-European societies. We are, non-Western societies. Now, what that does is that it relegates us into a zone of negation where there is nothing. But in order for a possibility, any aspiration towards being something or towards a plane where there is meaning, that plane is already put in front of us. It is Europe. Because we are non-European, the supposition is that you want to be European. Because you are non-Western, the supposition is that in order to escape your zone of negation, of nothingness, the immediate step is to become Western. Because you are non-developed, you are not developed, the immediate, step is to become developed. What does it mean to be developed? Is to be like the West. So there is an asymmetry that gets integrated into modernity. In fact, not that gets integrated. The logic of modernity is suffused with a certain asymmetrical relation between Africa and the West. It is that the West represents the ultimate stage. And the supposition is that we want to be like the West. If you want to understand what this means is, think of home if you had siblings and, you happen to be this unfortunate sibling who's not doing well at school, and you had a sibling who was doing well at school. And every time you were called, they refer to you at home as, this is the non-passing child in this house. Now, there is nothing inherent. You are not, that identity is not innate in you. It's an identity that is imposed from outside. But also imagine what it does, to you if you were to grow up in a household where people remind you all the time that you were this non-passing child. Or if that sounds too, harsh, think of if you were an undergrad student. Rather than refer you to an undergrad student, if I refer to you, you are a non-postgrad student. The supposition is that you want to be a postgrad student. It might just be that you don't have any aspiration towards becoming a postgrad student. You want to finish a degree and go live your life. But I'm tethering you already. It's a symbolization. It's a process of signification and symbolic meaning making. I'm already tethering you to your ultimate station. And I'm making being a postgrad your ultimate desire. So I'm making being Western your ultimate desire. I'm making being developed your ultimate desire because we are a non-developed society. The question is if I'm a non-developed society, I'm a non-developed society by whose standards? Who determined those standards that I'm a non-developed society? So our entanglement with modernity is such that, to put it simply, to oversimplify, it leaves us, we start from a position of disadvantage. Once you claim to be modern, you are accepting a position of disadvantage. And that position of disadvantage, you are saying, can only be remedied by an image of the West, because that's where your disabilities would be cured. Your disadvantages would be cured if you arrived at that ultimate stage that is, your ultimate station. Somewhere in the reading that we prescribed, actually, Kaviraj explains this, when talking about the Indian society. But if you get a chance to read, the article, you would see it. Let me see what page it is. Footnote number 49 on page 11. That's where he explains. This is what he says. My point is that pre-modern is a secondary characterization and does not point to any real similarities of these societies. So when you say African societies are pre-modern or pre-capitalist societies, there's nothing, basically, we are not pointing to any similarities amongst these societies themselves. What we are unable to do is to talk about these societies outside of Europe or outside of modern societies. So there is no possibility of developing a discourse about Uganda and South Africa and Kenya. That discourse is mediated by the West. Because when you say these are pre-modern societies, you're not talking about them amongst themselves, you're talking about them among themselves in relation to the West. And so your understanding of even African societies themselves has to be mediated by the West. So our entanglement with modernity is such that it leaves us in a zone of negation because of the process of epistemic violence that accompanies colonial violence that brings modernity into the continent. When nationalists accepted modernity as a result of nationalism, they accepted all of these advantages, of all these disadvantages. Now, unfortunately, these are not just disadvantages at the level of thought. These are disadvantages that actually shape our reality. These are disadvantages that mean that the process of development in Africa is a process of development that is aspiring towards Western development. These limitations mean that we must always look towards the West in order for us to be able to develop. Now, I'm going to end by directing you to a point that, Kaviraj makes on page 15 of the article that we prescribed. Somewhere at the top, the very first part of the article, he writes.
Dr. Lushaba, we can't hear you.
Oh, is it?
Now we can.
Now you can. Okay. So I was saying, I'm going to end, and hopefully, there are a few things that I had promised to deal with that I haven't. You'd raise them in the question and answer session. I'm conscious that I promised a lot of things, but you see, modernity is quite an involved discussion. So I'm going to end by, teasing out a point that Kaviraj makes in the article we prescribed on page 15. At the very top of, the article, I don't know whether our pagination is the same. He writes, in modern cultures, people turn their capacity for rational reason and criticism upon themselves, at least in two ways. Reflexivity leads to assessment of their own conduct from an exterior point of view. People begin to assess themselves from an exterior point of view, which was unavailable. This exterior point of view was unavailable to non-European societies before the arrival of Western ideas. This broke the obviousness and the immovability of cultural habitus, the impossibility of conceiving the world in any except an internal way. This made it possible for non-Europeans to evaluate their own societies from a kind of Archimedean point, leading to a rejection of conventional ways of social behavior. Now, this is the tragedy we face every day as a result of the importation of modernity into Africa. What is the tragedy? It is that because we think we've imbibed or internalized, the modern cultural values of knowledge, the capacity for rational reason, we turn that capacity for rational reason upon ourselves as people and as societies and assess our conduct from an exterior point of view. Self-alienation. And this exterior vantage point was unavailable to us, before Western ideas, came. And the result is that we've had to jettison our conventional ways of social behavior. Now, let me give you a very graphic way of thinking about this. All of you, I challenge you, your idea of success, your idea of what it would mean for you to be successful, did you originate it? Young people African people in all universities across the world who are studying hard day and night wanting to be successful, this idea of success, was it theirs? Did you originate this idea of success, or was it given to you externally? And so if it was given to you externally, because I'm sure it was given to you externally, where is the authenticity of thought? Where's the autonomy of thought for the African? We got into that tragedy because of modernity and the supposed universality of rational reason. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lushaba, and what a question to end on, especially for us students who trudge on with our education and in order to succeed, but maybe we haven't defined for ourselves what that success means, or as you put it, where it originates from. This has been another enlightening discussion, and I thank you so much for dedicating this time and your expertise to explaining these difficult concepts to us. I now want to turn it over to the chairperson, Trevor, to lead us in a Q&A, which he will moderate. And thank you so much to everyone who has sent questions in the Q&A so far. Those of you who haven't, this is now an opportunity to send them through, and Trevor will read them out.
Thank you so much, Bengi. Thank you so much, Dr. Lushaba, for yet another scintillating discussion, sharp as always. For our attendees, following what has been a very, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I think it's Bengi got frozen. I was saying that for our attendees, this is the opportunity for us to put questions to Dr. Lushaba. We already have 3 of them in the chat. And then I see Johnny Desta has their hand raised. Johnny, do you want to ask your question now? Johnny, you are unmuted. Please go ahead and ask your question. You had your hand raised.
I think
Okay,
we seem to be struggling.
Yeah, I think we shall get back to him. We shall get back to him. Well, turning to the questions that we do have in the chat at this moment, Bule is asking, yeah, he has 3 questions. The first question is, if Africans were led by our DNA of origin, I don't know what Bule means by that, but if Africans were led by our DNA of origin, do you think we'd be where we are in terms of modern development? Yeah, that's quite loaded. What if we were led by our DNA of origin, whether we'd be where we are in terms of modern development? The second question, with reference to the definition you gave of modernity, do you think it's worth investing in it's worth investing in as an African, considering possible fruitful opportunities for the African human race? Or do you think at some point the concept of modernity will be useless, or might even birth or rebirth another concept that will give meaning of evolving to the beings? And the third question is, if it were of your preference, would you rather have an African lifestyle clogged and centered around slow living, our indigenous origin, or do you think the modern world we live in is at least doing us justice in terms of development? Those are 3 questions, Dr. Lushaba. I want to add a 4th that has come through in the chat as well. You did mention that when our nationalist leaders at independence chose modernity or modernization as the mode of progress for our societies, they chose all those features of modernity that you've described with their attendant flaws. Are you able to speak to why these leaders chose modernization or modernity as a concept, as an idea for how to move our societies forward? What other alternatives were available to them? What was the sort of calculus they were doing between those alternatives and modernity? And how did that translate into modernity being a preferred paradigm over the available alternatives? Or are we also now becoming like the Durkheim's, Weber, and Marx, that because we have the benefit of hindsight, we can see what could have gone wrong. Maybe they couldn't have seen it at that moment. So those are the 4 questions we'll start with.
Okay, so let's start from the last one. There are a number of answers to the question. One is that if you think for a moment, if you think for a moment about the position of the nationalist elite as being, represented by a dialectic. So you have this forward movement that encounters its opposition and then decides, what am I going to do with this opposition? I must integrate it and make it part of my own logic so that I can move forward. What does that mean? So a human body, for instance, encounters a lot of diseases, and then decides to develop, an immunity or develop antibodies that then make fever, for instance, no longer a threat to health. It can cope with it. Now, what nationalism, or rather what modernity did, it turned nationalism precisely into something it could cope with. And so what these leaders did not realize is that they had become integrated into the forward march of the logic of modernity. They were no longer a threat. It didn't matter how loud they shouted as nationalists, we want to, develop our people, colonialism must get out. Colonialism could get out with ease because it knew that these were people that we had integrated into our logic in any case. And so, they were no longer a threat. They were not seeking to transgress the system. They basically wanted to work within the system. So they had been integrated into it. Now, why didn't they realize that they were being integrated into it? A few of them did. A few of them did. If you read Fanon very closely, when he decries the poverty, the intellectual poverty of the nationalist elite, he has a chapter, what's the title? On the tragedy of nationalism or something?
Pitfalls of national consciousness.
Pitfalls of the national consciousness. Now you can see there that, Fanon could already see, you can see how disparaging he is towards this nationalist elite that had integrated itself, or that had taken the logic of modernity and made it its own. Now, if you look at Cabral, if you look at Nkrumah, not that they didn't have their own limitations, but there were a few of them who recognized that, this kind of modernity we're being given, colonial modernity, was not going to take us anywhere. In fact, Nkrumah many times says that this independence is not going to take us anywhere. As is, it's not going to take us anywhere. And, proposed alternatives of a united continent and whatnot. I mean, it has its own limitations, but at least there were a few who recognized the limitation, and they all went down the same road. Their path was determined for them. We know where they ended. The West ensured, their destination. But the other point about, why it is that elite was already conducting its opposition against the master on the basis of the master's ideology, nationalism. And so they were already, it was more or less like, you want to get out of the mud, but you say, I'm going to use this mud, to build the scaffold. It was going to be impossible. From ab initio, it was an impossible task. They were never going to, succeed. Now, one of the things that happened at the moment of their integration is that the West sold them its own aspirations as their own aspiration. Today this has a different way of, working. Throughout the African continent, European countries take people on a tour. So Germany would take people from Uganda, from South Africa, and say, on a tour of Germany. So Goethe Institute or whatever institute would take you, on a visit to Germany for free for 2 weeks. Why do they? I mean, what interest do they have in making you tour? They are going to sell their idea, to you, so that when you return, you become a defender of Germany. You then tell your people, no, but you see, in Germany, they do this better. That's what they did to nationalists. They continue to do it to our people today, in different guises. And of course, lastly, it was intellectual domination that made them not realize. Now, today, that intellectual domination plays itself out in other ways. I hope, Ubuhle is still around, who asked the question about development today that is doing us justice. It is precisely that intellectual domination that makes us think that our slavery is serving us. Because I'm not sure, what development, what idea of development she's talking about. Where did that idea originate from? But as a student of development economics, someone who was taught development economics, I know how development economics and economics generally defines underdevelopment. It says it's the deficit between developed societies and, undeveloped society. And which are the developed society? It's a euphemism for the West. So it's the deficit. Now, I do not know whether that's the idea of development that any African today should sit and think about as doing us justice. I don't know what kind of justice it will do to us, but how do you get there? You get there by instilling in people who have Western education a fear, that is posed as, what is the alternative? Tell us what is the alternative. And then people say, well, if you can't tell us the alternative, then leave us to continue where we are. Until you've developed, fully your alternative, let us be where we are. Now that fear is typical of people who think that the Western, outlook is so superior such that getting out of it means misery. And as we did say, think of it just for a moment. As we sit here, we say that, there is development that is serving our justice. Think of the most basic thing that I ended with, your idea of success. Who told you you are successful? Did you for a moment sit and say, to be successful means this? This is what you labor for every day of your life, to be successful. But it is something that is given to you, that is not your original idea. How much oppression? So someone sits and looks at you and says, look at that guy, says, or that lady says she wants to be successful. But every day I keep changing what is the meaning of success. As he or she gets closer to it, I change the meaning of success, and then, again, they say, if you work a little harder, you would actually be. Because someone just has authority or monopoly over a definition, and then they can determine the trajectory of your life. And that we call development, or a just, system. I'm not sure it could be. The first question is a bit tricky. Where are we, in terms of our DNA? If we,
I think he's asking if on our own as Africans, we have the capacity, we would have had the capacity to propel our societies to the stage in which they are currently. So it seems to me that Bule is assuming that there are certain market advances that have been made. And he's wondering if absent external interaction, Africans on their own would have been able to imagine and create and bring about these advances that we have access to today, either by our own making or by borrowing from other societies.
Okay. So I'm going to answer this a little differently from the expectation. So one of the things that happens as a result of modernity coming to us via colonialism, and as a result of the wiping of the slate clean, one of the things that modernity has told us and we've internalized is that a movement forward or progress in Africa, always the impetus for such movement or progress must come from outside. So Africa, since the era of slavery, modernity, has been made to think and understand that the impetus, the catalyst for movement forward in the continent always must come from outside. So if it was not slavery, it was colonialism. Today, it is foreign direct investment. Now, I haven't heard the UK, Italy, or France saying they are looking for foreign direct investment. Because even when their economies hit a slump, the process of regeneration takes on a different meaning, as opposed to the continent. Because for us, the supposition is that always the intervention for a movement forward must come from outside. Now, that's why Buhle then is supposing that always for development, it could never be an auto-generated process. It must always be an exogenous process that comes from outside, because the capability to, move forward, the motive forces, could never be found within the continent. Always it must come, from outside. What that means, that supposition means, is that we then come to accept, as implicitly she is suggesting, that any movement that is externally triggered then constitutes progress. Now, because what is the benefit? What is going to lead us to is an unhelpful discourse. Do you want freedom or do you want water? You see, because that's what that is going to lead us into. Do you want water or you want freedom? So I'm going to give you water, but I'm going to deny you freedom. I'm going to oppress you, but I'm going to give you water. That's not a very helpful discourse. There is no one who ever said, the only way to get water is by accepting, oppression. And by the way, that water that you give me, you first take it from me. You first deny it to me, and then you bring it with the left hand. You take it with the right hand from me, and then you bring it with the right hand and say, I took your water, do you want it? But then you must compromise your freedom. No, it sounds laughable. In South Africa today, there is a debate about land. White people say to us, but we can't give you land because it's your land, because it's going to compromise food security. And so, we must negotiate about, how best, we can live, with this situation where you don't have your land. It's the same logic, which says you first take, it's like a thief who steals your car. And then you have found your car and you say, give me my car. And then the person says, but you see, you don't know how to drive. Me and you must have a conversation about how we are going to commute to work, but the car I shall keep.
Dr. Lushaba, I would add that actually, because if the car is stolen from your parent, and then it's now the grandchild that is demanding the car, the grandchild can never even imagine that the parent could have owned the car. There's that historical amnesia, which I think you're referring to as we have internalized this whole wiping the slate clean. So I think there's an imperative to reconnect with history so that folks can understand that the capacities for wealth creation within African societies were existent. These things are not out of our capabilities to ask questions of whether in our original DNA we could have done some of these things. But let us move to the next question. Bonita is asking two questions. One, is modernity to us as Africans a fetish of commodity? And then, relatedly, do you think, what do you think of African modernity, where modernity has been modified to work for Africa? And I think you, in your book, Development as Modernity, Modernity as Development, and Kaviraj as well in the article we read for today, come to the same conclusion, that we must take out the spirit of the Enlightenment, which is capacity for self-thought, and then use that not to just live in mimicry of the West, but to design our own new imaginaries and new paths for what our societies should look like. So I think Bonita is asking, do you have in mind what African modernity would look like, where we have modified it to work for Africa?
Now, to start precisely with that, there is an article, a short piece, written by a racist German philosopher called Kant. It's titled, What is Enlightenment? And in it, he says the answer to that question, what is enlightenment? He says, sapere aude, dare to think for yourself. He says that's what is enlightenment. Dare to think for yourself. Now, I think that, what we have to realize, one of the things that we have to realize, who asked the question, sorry? So I can.
She's Bonita.
Bonita. You see, one of the things we have to realize, and Bonita would then be able to understand, is that the very supposition that we have a right to think about our future is not a commonsensical thing. The very supposition, the conviction, let's put it, the very conviction that we can actually imagine a different future for ourselves, not many people have it. To get to a point where people are convinced that we can actually imagine a different future for ourselves, that is a first step that we have to take. Otherwise, you are going to run up against basically an unhelpful or an unproductive process where you go on your own and think about what the alternative would be. And then people think their own responsibility is to poke holes, on what you think is an alternative. First, what we need to inculcate is that confidence amongst African people that we can actually imagine a different future for ourselves. That on its own, dare, sapere aude, dare to think, for yourself, is itself a step towards, enlightenment. Is a step towards imagining, a modernity for ourselves. Now, the other part of that answer, the other part to that is that, look, we know what an alternative should look like. Its elements are obvious. You don't have to think hard to realize that there is something that happens in the world. And this is throughout the world. Slavery existed, has always existed, by the way, even prior to transatlantic slave trade. Europeans enslaved themselves, Africans enslaved themselves, but there was a distinct kind, of in that process, something else went on. A slave was not something to be annihilated. Slaves actually retain an element prior to transatlantic slave trade. Slaves retained an element. For a lack of a better term, let's call it humanity. But what happens is that when slavery ends, this is what happens. There is an ethical decision that is taken that a human being cannot be a commodity. There's no magic that happens. It's just a decision that is taken that says a human being, it's unethical to make a human being a commodity. Now, what would it mean? What would it take to take a decision, an ethical decision, that it's unethical to make food a commodity, such that food must not become something to make profit on, whilst other people are going hungry? It will mean that you first must have an idea or a confidence to say that there is a different future that can be built. Because if you remain within the present logic, then we are going to say, yeah, but what about the people who produce the food? Where should they make money? Now, we are going to turn us back into the commodification of life as if it's a natural state of affairs, where people must make money or profit at the expense of other people. Now, if the point is not clear, what I'm trying to say is that, one, that confidence or that conviction that we can think for ourselves, we would have taken a great stride towards inventing our modernity. If we were all convinced, or many of us were convinced, that we do possess the capability to imagine a different future, then we would have taken, because Kant says, what is enlightenment? it's the capability to think for yourself. In fact, it says dare to think for yourself. So, yep.
Proceed.
There was the second part of the question about
whether modernity is a fetish of commodity for us as Africans.
I think I began the talk by trying to explain how, basically modernity has turned itself into a fetish. You only have to think about, if you want to see how a fetish, works, is think about someone who drives a BMW, and the argument that you would hear between someone who drives a BMW and someone who drives a Mercedes. One says, oh no, this car is far more comfortable, that this car drives better. The logic of a car is to take you from point A to point B. All the other things to it, it's fetish. All those other things you tell us about what is the benefit of a Mercedes, those are fetish. It's the same thing with modernity. The purpose of existence in the world is the perpetuation of life. All the other things are a fetish. Now, modernity presents itself to us as if it were this total package that, is, in fact, it's an object of desire, basically. Things modern present themselves as, an object of desire. You can see how, we desire it, how people are infatuated with it, with its idea of success, with its idea of making it in the world. Let me give you a bad example. So I teach at the University of Cape Town. It's a white institution. You teach with white people who, for 10 years you can work with, they never know your name. For 10 years, you have someone who's your office neighbor, they don't know your name. And then you have Black people in those institutions who think they have become successful. Someone just next door has just shown you that you are in an entity. They have not bothered to even correctly pronounce your name in 10 years or even 20 years of working with them. Now, how could that be a system that we desire? How does that system, if I'm putting the question wrongly, how has that system managed to keep us allured to it? How have we not gotten to a point where we say this cannot be? Every Black person in South Africa, maybe it's a bad way to put it, most academics in South Africa aspire to go to these institutions, and they get there, they think they have succeeded in a place that, tells them that they are non-entities. That's the allure. That's the fetish, of modernity.
Dr. Lusha, you're leaving us with more questions than we're asking you, but we shall proceed. So I think that that question, I think, answers Hannah's question. Hannah was also asking, how do we get out of this modernity rat hole, so to say, its relationship to education, decoloniality, and Pan-African ideology? I think your answer, consistent with last time, has always been, we must have the courage to imagine new, unbeaten paths that we must take as a society. And it seems that responsibility falls more to us, younger people, than the guys who've come before us. Tabiso is asking, how can young people benefit from the modern world as it is, while also trying to break mental shackles that make us view it as superior? Is that even a possibility, or is it a paradox?
That is benefiting from so-called modern world.
Yeah, the world as it is today, can we benefit from it while breaking mental shackles? And then he's asking, is that even possible, or is it just a paradox?
I think it is possible to benefit from the modern world. And I here going to return us to a point I think I hinted to in our last engagement. And I'm going to use myself as an example because people often then say, I'm duplicitous. I studied Western and very colonial education. My misfortune was to go to the university prior to the attainment of independence. But here we are. Now, because Western modernity took away our modes of cognizing, or simply our modes of thought as Africans, and substituted them with its own Western knowledge. As it is, we have to go through Western knowledge. But here is the point about education. It is that education, there are two elements to it. It is the content, the substantive content of knowledge, and then the ability or the capability for critical thinking, such that you may then even turn critical of the knowledge, the content that is taught to you. Now, if we thought of education in that sense, so that we don't swallow, peel and hard and whatever, everything, both the content, the substantive content, and the critical thinking, which is how do you relate to that content? I think because we are chasing this idea of success, we then forget that actually there are two components to this. So you tell me this is how, the world is. And then I say to you, fine, you say this is how the world is. I'm not that keen on how you say the world is. I'm keen on how we come to know how the world is. So that critical faculty, I think that that's what we have to take out of Western modernity. That critical attitude towards the present. I think that is a great benefit that we can derive, from Western modernity, in order that we may then recreate a different world. Now, let me be very explicit. We are so entangled with the Western world today, such that a return to an original Africa, traditional, Africa that is virgin of any foreign intrusion, that return is impossible. There's no one here. Coverage talk about it as indigenism. There is absolutely no possibility of returning to that Africa. When we critique Western thought and Western knowledge, we are not in any way suggesting a return, because that on its own is an indication of a denial of our capability for thought. You are saying to us, we can't recognize where we are and fashion from where we are a path that is beneficial to us, as Africans. We can, from the present, fashion for ourselves a path that is beneficial. It does not mean a return, to an Africa virgin of, foreign intrusion. It's impossible to recreate that Africa.
Dr. Lushaba, I want to push you a little on that. You said we must take that critical attitude out of Western modernity.
Yeah.
Don't you think that we then also will start to fetishize reason, so to speak? Or are you saying that that critical attitude itself must then also be turned on a rational thought as a mode of thinking to then allow us explore other possible modes of thinking and make a choice of whether we want to stick with it or go with other modes of thought? Like, is there, don't you see, isn't there that danger of let us take the critical attitude out of it and then remain with that, which would definitely lead us into just a recreation of the same thing we want to step out of? I don't know what you have to say to that.
Now, you make a point. I think Coverage also gestures towards that point, in his article, where he says, we must turn this critical attitude towards Western thought itself, so that if it says, everything is available for critique, it itself must be available for critique, and jettisoning if it's found to. But here is my disagreement with Coverage on that point. It is that Coverage lends in a secular, way of thinking, because he says, let us turn that critical thinking to Western thought itself. What he doesn't realize is that in that process, he's going to use the very same instruments of Western thought, to assess critical Western thought itself. So it's basically going to be an immanent critique that remains within Western thought itself. So we are going to look within Western thought itself for instruments to critique Western thought. I'm saying, if we take that critical attitude that we get, it must not have a predetermined direction of progress, where we move in that unilinear direction. So if we take that critical attitude, we may decide to turn our backs towards Western modernity and Western thought and say, we're going to develop a different, regime of thought. Now, what would that regime of thought, for instance, look like? You see, reason, you are right. Once you accept reason, you are always on a losing battle as a Black person. Go and try and argue your point on the basis of reason. You are never going to win against a white person because reason is white, because you were always outside of reason. So if you remain, within the ambit of rational reason, you are not going to win. I propose elsewhere what I call modes of cognizing. You see, cognizing and thinking are two different things. African modes of cognizing, when you cognize as opposed to thinking. So if you think and you confronted with this contraption of a computer in front of me, when you think, you have this object that you must analyze, and your logic, your ability for reason says that you must be able to explain everything here. Cognizing, on the other hand, says, how do I apprehend the world in front of me? Now, the line is very thin until you immerse yourself into other modes of cognizing. You look at the world not as an object. You look at the world as, and look at yourself as being in the world, and being in the world with all the other people in the world and all the other things in the world. And then you think, what is my position in this world where I'm in it with others and with all the other things that are in the world that have exactly the same right, so to say, with me to be in the world. The trees have the same right with you to be in the world. You don't have, there's nothing in the world that is an object to you for your pleasure. That would be a different kind of a mode of cognizing. That would mean that we then begin to relate to the world in a different way, not in a rational, calculative way.
Dr. Lushaba, I want to push back on that a little bit.
Yeah.
It says, and this answered, Bonita had another question about whether it's possible for us to reclaim values from pre-colonial Africa to the modern times. You say that is absolutely a foreclosed possibility. My assumption
to completely recreate a traditional Africa.
Okay.
Yes.
My assumption is that part of why that is a foreclosed possibility is that those of us, the would-be agents of that reclamation or recreation, or whatever one to term it as, are too far gone in this modern way of doing things that we don't have access to what the pre-colonial world was like. I don't think there's any African living today who lived in pre-colonial Africa. We don't have that at least direct primary access to the stuff from the pre-colonial. We can only approximate, estimate, and try to bring that stuff back. Similarly, if that is one of the bases on which it is difficult, if not impossible, for us to reclaim and recreate pre-colonial Africa, if all we've known as young people through the education systems we've come through is rational thought, and you're challenging us to step out of this thing and imagine new modes of cognizing, on what raw materials are we drawing to even imagine other possible modes of cognizing that we don't have access to. I don't know, maybe you've read some stuff that makes it possible for you to think about a non-rational way of thinking, to say I must be in the world and look at myself as having equal rights of existence with everything else in the universe, trees, stones, blah, blah, blah. I'm not here to conquer them. I'm just here because I'm here. So how do I coexist with them harmoniously? But we do not have access to those resources. So I'm trying to draw the parallels that if it's difficult to reclaim pre-colonial Africa because we don't have access to what it was like, because none of us lived during that time, what are we going to draw on to come up with alternative modes of cognizing if all we have access to is rational thought? We don't know what else is out there. We're just locked in this thing, and the task you're giving us is understandable, but the practical bit of it is seeming difficult. Like, where do we go? What sources are we going to drink from to start getting some coordinates of where we start to go in that direction?
Okay. You know what you've just done? You've just provided a rationalization that you must then extend to the nationalist elite. All the critique you had of the nationalist elite. So why should we blame the nationalist elite? If we are also making the same excuse, but it's a wrong excuse. The resources are there. The problem is people who have colonized minds. The resources are in the languages we speak, in our African languages. You find them in many of the African languages that I speak. You find elements of an alternative world. Now, the task is, if you don't speak your language, then the task, of course, it appears impossible. Now, people who have embraced colonial, colonial mentality, Fela has a song for them. He calls it colonial mentality, the song. The point is that the resources are there. Our languages, and remember what we're looking for is that we're not looking for tangible things. We're looking for principles and ethical principles. And then we build the work of, we write so much about the work of imagination, the work of creating, so what do we mean when we say, the work of creating? Because the basics are there in our languages, but the basics are also there in our cultural practices. We can't recreate them as they are, but we can build from there. Now, let me give you an example. If you want to build a harmonious world and you ask me, so what resources would you find in my language, isiZulu? In fact, not only isiZulu, in many Nguni languages. You see, many Nguni languages don't allow you to call an elderly person by name. It's Uputi, Abuti, it's Umalume, uncle and whatnot. Now, what happens in that kind of a relationship? It is that when you have put that prefix, Ubaba, which is father and whatnot, it then circumscribes the things that are possible in that relationship. It's like when you call someone enemy and you call someone friend, a friend. When I call you my enemy, I'm legitimating a certain kinds of things that are possible to do to you. Those things become impossible when I say you are my friend. So it means that language actually helps to do what? To govern behavior. First, I must negate the meaning of those things. I must negate the fact that you are a friend in order to be able, to inflict harm on you. I can't be calling you a friend and then I'm inflicting harm on you. So it means that if you have an orientation, towards a human being, that orientation limits or circumscribes behavior. But when you have lost that, and then every human being is no longer, malume or anything, everyone is a homo economicus who's hustling like I'm hustling. So because we are all hustling, it's the survival of the fittest. You know, I can leave you behind, you know, and forge ahead. So ideas actually create the world. The world doesn't exist first and follow ideas. And no one can tell me that we don't have ideas, you know, in our cultural practices, in our languages, but also just go back to the rural areas and see how people live.
Thank you, Dr. Lushaba. I think that's a very important first step. When you start pointing us to some resources where we can draw to start disabusing ourselves of this domination of colonial thought. We are all victims, and some of us are too far gone. But when you were speaking, you made me think that perhaps most of us, who some might describe as the elite of our societies, because the sort of education we've gotten and the implications it has for the kinds of positions we're going to have in society, either by our socioeconomic class or responsibility we shall hold, we probably may not be the revolutionary class to bring about a change as such, because the material is with the people who are further away from modernity and colonial domination, mental domination, than we are, right? And so, but then there have been only a few instances of peasant revolutions, if we say rural-based revolutions in the world, because leadership is difficult, coordination is difficult across. So I think it gets more complicated, but I think you've done well in pointing us to some of the resources we can look at, going back to observe, you know, how people live lives in rural areas, the languages that we speak, interacting with them differently. There was one more question. There was a hand that was raised.
Can I just intervene there?
Yes. Before you come in, Dr. Lushaba, I want to see if Michael still has his question. He had his hand raised. Michael, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead and ask your question, and then Dr. Lushaba can answer those two final questions, and we shall close after that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. It's really nice to hear Dr. Lushaba speak again. The last time was last year. It's really illuminating as ever. Dr. Lushaba, I really enjoyed the reading. My question really is how, as Africans or African youth who carry the burden that our nationalist forefathers carried, how should we begin to think our ways? The moderator just used the word disabuse. How should we think our way out of these different encumbrances? So you began with the idea of, you said the conditions of the possibility of modernity. So that modernity in itself, in that sense, is a product of certain conditions. The breeding Kaviraj spoke of the functional relationship of the constitutive elements of modernity. I don't know what page it falls on your page, but in the particular version that was circulated on page 508, Kaviraj says that modernity, when we are talking about modernity, I'm quoting Kaviraj, it is a number of processes of social change, and then went on to list industrialization, centrality of the state, sociological individuation, urbanization, and so on. So that this modernity is a product, is a consequence. And I was wondering if, as we continue to evoke Weber, we evoke these other Western philosophers.
Durkheim.
Yeah, Durkheim, thank you. That how are we living ourselves outside of this project of modernity? How were Africans, or how are Africans even currently contributing to modernity? And is that, this is my question, would that be a way in addition to many of the solutions you have been profiling, would that be a way of even educating ourselves so that in decolonizing, in reforming, in getting out of these problems, that we see ourselves within modernity as co-creators of it? Is that a possibility? And if it is, how do you think that would begin that process of reformation? Thank you.
Dr. Lushaba, you'll take those two questions. You need to make a comment before. So you'll take Michael's question. The other final question you have from Olivier is similarly related. How should we, I think you've really provoked people's thinking. Everyone is asking, how should we define and understand a sort of modernity that reflects our own daily lives under a spirit of inclusiveness? I would take it that the answer you gave it to us, we must have the courage to start thinking of new modes of cognition. So you may not have to deal with Olivier's question, but if you want to re-emphasize some of the points you made earlier, please feel free. But please, the comment you need to make earlier, Michael's question, and we shall draw the curtain on today's discussion. Thank you.
Okay. No, well, you had triggered something in my mind, and it was just related to what you had said about the other resources we can draw from. It triggers my mind. It ikes my mind, in fact. I don't know in other places, but I mean, a few other African societies I've been to, this I found to be the same thing, including South Africa. Most of the people we consider illiterate, or most of the people we consider not modernized, one, they live longer. Two, they do better at sustaining families. Their marriages, and, sustaining families in that sense. Just take those two things. They live longer and they do better at sustaining families. As modern people, we do woefully in those things. Those two simple things. We die young. We can't maintain families. We go, to marriage counselors day in and day out, and we still end up divorcing. Why hasn't anyone said no? Maybe there is something we may learn from there. Why is it that they live longer? And it can't be by coincidence that they live longer. It can't be by coincidence that they do better at maintaining families, at sustaining families. We are products of those families. We saw. But why haven't young intellectuals, many people call themselves anthropologists, they go study, societies. Why haven't we, in deciding what to study, decided on a concerted effort, to study the things that are going to give us answers to these kinds of questions? And so I think that it's not that it's impossible because, the peasant revolutions are difficult, peasant revolutions are rare. I think we must just redefine this thing called the intellectual. What is the role of the intellectual? Now you are going to finish your studies, become PhD holders and work in the universities, and they're going to tell you, you must write in journals that are read in the West that have no relationship with your society. And then you are going to be infatuated with it, and then, you are going to perpetuate it. If we redefined this thing called an intellectual, we would know that its responsibility is basically to go and do those kinds of studies. How it is that people, who aren't fully integrated into the cycle of Western modernity, how it is that they're able to maintain stronger teeth, maintain life longer, and all of those things. I think we have a lot to learn rather than assume that we have something to teach those people. I think they have more things to teach us. So coming to Michael's point, how can we become co-creators? I must say that, as you study further, you are going to encounter a strand of thought, and it's very strong and persuasive. It's spearheaded by an Egyptian, if I'm not mistaken, an Egyptian scholar who's based at Columbia called Abu Lila Lugol. Abu Lila Lugol has argued quite convincingly for some people that actually this thing called Western modernity is not Western modernity, because right from the beginning, actually, Africans have been contributing or contributed to it. So even before the factories in Manchester, which we assume to be the first factories that came out, of the cotton, industrial revolution, Abu Lila Lugol shows us that actually earlier industries had developed, prior to, the 16th century. And these industries are locatable, in other circuits, in the Caribbean and in other places. And uses that argument to say, so this has never been Western modernity. It's never been an exclusively Western project. Africans have been contributing, have been at the center of it. Now, the evidence, the historical and archaeological evidence is quite convincing. I think what I disagree with in that strand of thought is that it simply just refuses to acknowledge a relationship between primary contradictions and secondary contradictions. It may be that we have been contributing to this Western modernity, but we've been contributing at whose terms? Has it been, at our own terms or at the terms that are set for us, by the dominant motive players in that whole process? And in that case, I would think that if we have been contributing on terms that are set for us by the West, we must acknowledge that, yes, we've been contributing, but we've been contributing to a project or into a process that is not our own. And so we cannot quite claim, that modernity as our own. And so the possibility of recreating it, I knew it would mean that first we must strive to change power relations within its structure. Now, that's the point. I've been trying to illustrate that we can't change the power relations, within it, because, it would be like taking the master's tools, in order to change those power relations. So I'm quite not convinced. I'm unable to say to Michael that we can actually recreate, or become co-creators of this modernity, because already our role in it has been set. And it would have to collapse for us to reset, the assignation of roles in it. I don't think that Western modernity conceives of itself where our role is different from what it is today. So I think that we must seek to transgress it. We can't work with it, as it is. And one example of how it would be impossible, it's precisely that process of individuation. Unfortunately, it was one of the elements of modernity that I didn't deal with, the process of individuation. Now, one of the major problems with, this idea of individuation is that as Lwazi Lushaba, I can claim to be successful when my people are not successful. What kind of success is that? And so I must be able to stand on a mountain top and say, I became successful, but my people are not successful. I don't know what kind of success it is that, enables people to say they are successful when they are own people. And when I say their own people, even their immediate family are not successful, but you say you are successful because of this process of individuation, the assumption that the world is meant for individuals, exists for individuals.
Dr. Lushaba, thank you. Actually, I don't know how I forgot to ask you to speak to individuation, but I'm glad you've made a point. And maybe you point us to some resources where folks can go and familiarize themselves with the process of individuation as a constituent process, element, part of the modernization. But we are way over what we promised. And so I want to bring today's discussion to a close. We are deeply, deeply, deeply grateful to you for time, energy, and making yourself available to help us grapple with very difficult concepts and answer very important questions. My most important takeaway was the question you started with in the previous session, which is how do we prime our minds to be able to think of Africa's problems correctly? And I think the two sessions that you've delivered on nationalism and modernity that start to challenge us to turn the critical attitude that we have been trained in onto the knowledge itself that we have obtained is an important starting point. From the questions we've had today and the questions that we had in the last session, it is quite evident that you have sparked thought, and most of us are asking ourselves, well, if we have figured out that Western modernization is quite problematic and perhaps that our odds in it are predetermined, we need to go elsewhere. But the question is, where must we go? Now, for us as the organizing team of the Pan-African Youth Conference, that gives us much joy because these are the sorts of conversations we hope to facilitate and to bring us to that conclusion. The four questions that guide the work we do are, who are we as Africans? A question you dealt with elaborately at the conference last year. Where are we as a continent dealing with the contemporary state of Africa? How did we get here? Dealing with the historical phenomena that have shaped Africa as we know it. And then, in the Fanonian spirit, asking ourselves, where do we go from here? What must we do as young people today, as a generation, to advance the struggle of Africa's liberation? So we are glad to see that the sorts of conversations that we've had over these past 2 weekends have brought most of us, if not all of us, to the point of asking, how do we go from here? What must we do? Because you have helped us to deal very, very ably with the question of how we have gotten to the state where we are today. As you're aware, Dr. Lushaba, and as our attendees are aware, we shall be continuing the Tangaaza series next weekend and the 3 following weekends. We are having now laid the foundation for nationalism and modernity, conceptually understanding those ideas and some estimates you've given us on how those have shaped our reality today. We shall now be dealing more specifically with how those two twin ideas of nationalism and modernity, which came to us primarily through the process of colonization, have gone ahead to shape postcolonial Africa. We shall be having Dr. David Simba Ngendo, who is from the Makerere Institute of Social Research in Kampala, Uganda, who will be grappling with the question of how the twin ideas of nationalism and modernity have shaped Africa's post-colonial political experience. In other words, politics of the post-colony. Dr. Simba is going to be talking about Lumumba and his project in the Congo, his articulations of nationalism and modernity, and his short-lived experience with trying to forge a nation in the Congo on the basis of those ideas. The following weekend, March 5th, we shall have Dr. Johan Furi from Stellenbosch, who is a historian of Africa, who is a scholar of the economic history of Africa, who will be dealing with the question of how has how has modernity as an idea, as the anchor of Africa's development vision, because as we have acknowledged from your talk, our nationalist leaders, our independence leaders took modernity, accepted modernity as the vision of development, the direction in which our societies had to go. Dr. Furi will be helping us deal with the question of how has that vision shaped the socio-economic reality in Africa today. And we shall close with Dr. Chio Mbembe, who will answer the question of how nationalism and modernity have shaped culture in the post-colony. Dr. Mbembe's talk will come 2 weeks before the conference, which will be held on March 26th. And these sessions, Tangaaza, as we've communicated earlier, are helping us lay the groundwork for then the important discussions we're going to be having during the conference on which way Africa, or where do we go from here, in other words. We are extremely grateful, Dr. Lushaba, because you've done, I think, most of the heavy lifting in helping us ground ourselves in a correct understanding, analytical lens of these very important concepts of nationalism and modernity. We want to thank in a very special way all the attendees who made the time to be here. Between this session alone, we've had people from over 23 African countries who joined us today. Last time we had folks from over 35 different African countries. We are hoping to foster this Pan-African spirit, and that if some of us might get convinced and that we might summon the courage from somewhere of the duties that history will impose on us, maybe this can be the start of a coalition of actors that will start to take Africa in a different direction. So thank you very much, guys, for making the time. We look forward to seeing you two again next Saturday. I also want to thank very much the team that we work with at the Pan-African Youth Conference to make this possible. They are unsung heroes, and so we are deeply, deeply grateful to them. Thank you so much, everyone.